She entered the chapel just as the sun dipped behind the distant trees, the golden light failing to reach the cracked stone floor where shadows had begun to gather. The air was thick with the scent of decay and dust, and every step she took echoed like a warning through the silent hall. Her wheelchair squeaked softly against the cold stone, a sound she feared would announce her presence to someone or something lurking unseen. She had been told never to enter this place, yet curiosity, or perhaps a deeper, unexplainable pull, had drawn her inside. The wooden doors groaned behind her as they closed, sealing her within a world that seemed frozen in time, untouched for decades, if not longer. The stained glass windows, fractured and coated with years of grime, threw shards of colored light across the pews, painting the hall in hues of red and green that seemed more sinister than beautiful. Each flicker of color felt alive, shifting, almost watching her movements with a sentient awareness. She paused near the center aisle, taking in the oppressive silence. No bird sang. No wind stirred the tattered curtains, only the faint sound of her breathing and the distant drip of water from a leaky roof. It was as if the world outside had been replaced by an echo of what had once existed, memories frozen into the walls themselves. The pews were broken and splintered, some overturned, some standing as if frozen mid-fall. The altar was dark, and the remnants of burnt candles hinted at rituals long abandoned, or perhaps never meant for innocents to witness. She felt a chill creep through her, and instinctively hugged her arms around herself despite the warmth of the day outside. Something about the air felt alive, heavy, as though it waited with patience for her next move. She moved further in, each wheel of her chair catching on cracks in the floor. The sound startled her more than it should have, like an intruder she couldn't see. She looked around, trying to catch sight of the source, but the chapel remained empty. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. She remembered the stories her father had told her, tales of people disappearing in the shadows of the old chapel, never to return. She had dismissed them as exaggerations meant to keep her cautious, but now the fear in her chest told her that there might be truth buried in the myth. The air pressed against her lungs, heavy with expectation, and her eyes darted from one shadow to another, hunting for movement that might reveal the secrets this place held. Every small sound seemed amplified. A creak of the roof beam or the distant skitter of a rodent became monumental, threatening to announce her presence to whatever entity lingered in these halls. A sudden shift in the light caught her attention. A beam of dying sunlight passed through one of the broken stained glass panels and landed on the floor near the altar. The colors seemed to shimmer unnaturally, red hues deeper, green ones darker than the sun could naturally cast. She rolled closer, curiosity fighting with fear, and noticed faint markings etched into the stone floor. Symbols that resembled nothing she had ever seen before, spirals and jagged lines carved with deliberate intent. They formed a circle, centered perfectly in front of the altar, and at the center of the circle was an indentation, worn smooth as though something had rested there for centuries. She felt a pull toward it, an almost magnetic draw that made her hands tremble and her breath hitch. Her mind raced with questions she wasn't ready to answer. Who had left these symbols? Why here? And why did they feel so alive, as though the carvings themselves were waiting for her to complete some invisible task? She inched closer, the wheelchair squeaking on the stone floor, and almost immediately the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She could feel a presence, not behind her, not beside her, but within the air itself. It pressed against her, a cold weight that made her body feel heavier, her arms sluggish. The sensation was suffocating, yet she couldn't look away. She wanted to scream, to call for someone, anyone, but the silence swallowed any attempt at sound. Then, without warning, a whisper echoed through the chapel. It was soft, indistinct, yet unmistakable. A name, perhaps, or a warning. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The whisper came again, a little louder this time, and though she couldn't understand the words, the tone carried menace. She tried to trace the sound, turning her head slowly, eyes scanning every shadow, every dark corner. The whispers seemed to move with her, never stationary, always just beyond her perception, wrapping around her senses and tightening the grip of fear around her chest. Her gaze settled on the altar. Something there moved, or maybe it was her imagination playing tricks on her. A figure, indistinct, almost ethereal, seemed to step forward, though it was impossible to tell if it was flesh or shadow. The presence was immense, as if the air itself had coalesced into blocking her path and demanding attention. She wanted to retreat, to escape the chapel and the weight pressing down on her, but the wheelchair refused to obey, as though the floor itself resisted her movement. Her mind flashed with the stories she had been told, of those who had dared to enter the chapel and never left. Faces appeared in her memory, distorted, twisted in fear or pain, always staring at her with hollow eyes. She realized, with a cold clarity, that these were not mere stories, but warnings. Warnings of what happened when one ventured too far, when one trespassed into a place where time and fear had intertwined into something eternal and unforgiving. She forced herself forward, inch by inch toward the altar. The air grew colder, each breath visible in faint puffs, as though winter had descended suddenly within the chapel. Shadows stretched unnaturally, bending against the walls and floor, forming shapes that seemed almost human, writhing, twisting. The whispers grew louder, layering over one another, creating a cacophony that made her ears ache. She wanted to cover her ears, to block out the sound, but that made the presence feel closer, as though the very act of resistance drew it nearer. At the center of the altar circle, she saw it, a small object, blackened and unremarkable at first glance, yet emanating a force that was tangible. It pulsed faintly, as though alive, calling to something within her, something she didn't understand. She reached for it, hands shaking violently, and the moment her fingers brushed its surface, a shockwave of sensation coursed through her. Fear, pain, and an indescribable longing mingled into one, a sensation so powerful it made her collapse forward slightly, wheelchair tipping. As if the chapel itself sought to claim her. The whispering stopped suddenly. Silence fell, thick and oppressive. She dared to lift her head, eyes wide, heart racing. The figure at the altar was gone, yet she could feel it still, watching, waiting. A cold draft passed over her, brushing her hair and making the candle flames dance violently in their sockets. It was as though the chapel itself was alive, breathing with ancient patience, measuring her every move. Tears stung her eyes, not only from fear, but from the realization that she was utterly alone. There was no help coming, no one to rescue her from this place suspended in time. And yet, even in that overwhelming terror, a part of her mind resisted, refusing to surrender completely. She understood now why people whispered of this place, why stories lingered in fearful tones. The chapel was not merely a building, it was a keeper of something vast, something ancient, something that demanded acknowledgement and respect. Minutes, or perhaps hours, passed. Time seemed irrelevant. Every small sound, every creak of wood, every flutter of dust became a potential threat. She moved carefully, inching backward toward the doors she had entered through, and then paused. Something stirred behind the altar, a shadow, a shape, a movement too deliberate to ignore. Her pulse quickened, an instinct screamed at her to flee, but she forced herself to observe. Out of the darkness emerged the faint outline of what looked like a figure, draped in shadow, indistinct yet undeniable. It raised an arm, pointing toward her, and in that gesture she understood. She had trespassed. She had been, and now she was part of the chapel's story. Her voice caught in her throat, but she managed a whisper. a plea for mercy that likely went unheard. The figure remained silent, unwavering, until she dared to look away, upon which it slowly receded, melting back into the darkness. She rolled toward the doors, each movement deliberate, careful not to draw attention, careful not to awaken whatever else lingered in this place. The chapel seemed to pulse around her, alive and aware, and she felt the weight of every previous visitor who had stepped within its walls, every story of terror now tangible in the air itself. She reached the threshold, fingers trembling on the handle, and pushed the doors open. The daylight outside never seemed so bright, so warm, so real. But even as she left, she knew it had not ended. The whispers would follow her, faint and persistent, tugging at her mind. The shadows would linger at the edges of her vision. The chapel had marked her, indelibly, and the memory of it would haunt her forever. And somewhere, deep inside, she knew she would return, drawn by the same pull that had led her into the darkness in the first place. The chapel waited, patient. Shadows folded into the corners, whispers threaded through the air, and though she had escaped, she carried a piece of it within her, a fragment of fear, a sliver of something ancient and unknowable, that would grow with each retelling of the story. She realized that some places are alive, not with the warmth of life, but with the weight of memory and the inevitability of terror. And some stories are never truly left behind. The air outside the chapel was cold and heavy, a persistent fog ring around the trees and the tombstones, hiding the landscape in a gray haze that seemed to stretch forever. She had barely escaped the chapel, yet the memory of the shadows, the whispers, and the figure at the altar clung to her mind with the weight of a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Her hands shook as she pushed herself along the overgrown path, leading away from the ruined building. Each wheel of her chair sank slightly into the soft earth, leaving tracks that seemed to mark her vulnerability, exposing her passage to the world she did not yet understand. The forest around her was silent, oppressive, as if the trees themselves were watching, observing her every movement, waiting for a sign of weakness. She tried to focus on the sound of her breathing, on the motion of the wheels, anything that could anchor her in the reality she had known before entering the chapel. But that reality had shifted irrevocably. The fog seemed alive, moving with intent, wrapping itself around the trunks of the ancient trees, slipping into the spaces between rocks, creeping across the ground like a living thing. Every step forward felt like a test, every second spent outside that cursed place filled with the anticipation of being called back. As if the chapel had a will of its own, she recalled the figure at the altar, the way it had moved without sound, the weight of its presence pressing against her chest. It was impossible to describe. It was neither fully human nor fully shadow. And yet, it had existed in the same space as her, acknowledging her, claiming her as part of its domain. The memory made her shiver, and she wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the tremor in her body as a quiet, gnawing fear began to spread. She couldn't tell if it was fear of the figure itself or the realization that the world was not as it appeared, that some forces moved beyond human comprehension, shaping destinies in ways she would never control. Her path led her through the forest, the fog thickening with every turn, and she began to notice small details she had overlooked in her panic. Twisted branches scratched at her sleeves, fallen leaves whispered under the wheels, and every sound seemed magnified, amplified by the silence that pressed down from above. She felt the presence of eyes on her, not just the chapel's lingering shadow, but something else entirely. Predators of a different kind, hidden, patient, waiting to see what she would do next. The weight of being observed became unbearable, and she wondered if the chapel had sent something with her, if her escape had been part of the design, a test she had yet to understand. As she moved deeper into the forest, the path began to narrow, flanked by brambles and twisted roots that threatened to catch the wheels of her chair. She struggled through the thorns, each movement drawing fresh scratches across her arms. The pain was real, grounding her, and yet it was almost welcome compared to the suffocating uncertainty that had haunted her since entering the chapel. With every obstacle, every scrape of wood against skin, she felt a tension in her chest, a tightening that mirrored the grip of the chapel itself. She realized then that fear was not just in the mind, it had a physical form, pressing against muscles, slowing motion, making even the smallest effort seem monumental. Her thoughts drifted to the stories she had heard about the chapel. Tales of disappearances, of people driven to madness, of shadows that followed them even outside the walls. She had dismissed these stories once, considered them warnings for children or excuses for the weak. Now she understood their truth. The stories were not exaggerated. They were fragments of memory left behind by those who had touched something older, darker, something that moved with purpose and patience. She felt the weight of generations pressing down on her, the collective terror of those who had entered and never returned, a tapestry of fear woven into the very ground she rolled over. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time was meaningless in the forest shrouded in fog. She stopped to rest, placing her hands on the wheels, taking in the eerie quiet. She tried to organize her thoughts, to make sense of what she had witnessed. The figure, the altar, the symbols etched into the floor. All of it had purpose, though she did not yet comprehend it. She began to realize that the chapel was not simply a place, it was a conduit, a crossroads between what was known and what should remain hidden. And she, by entering, had become entangled in its design. A sudden sound made her freeze, the rustling of leaves, a snapping branch, subtle but deliberate, as if someone or something was moving just beyond the fog. She strained her eyes, trying to pierce the gray veil, but the fog swallowed everything beyond a few feet. Her heart pounded, every beat loud in her ears. She wished she had the courage to turn and flee in a straight line, but instinct told her that doing so would only make her prey. Survival demanded patience, observation, and understanding of the unseen rules governing this forest. The hours stretched on. She encountered small signs of the chapel's reach extending beyond its walls. Symbols carved into tree trunks, faint scratches along rocks, and subtle patterns in the arrangement of leaves and branches. Each detail seemed purposeful, almost like a trail, not meant to guide her out, but to make her notice, to make her aware of the chapel's omnipresence. She began to understand that nothing here was accidental. Every element, every shadow, every sound was a part of the design meant to impress upon her a lesson. The world was alive with forces beyond comprehension, and curiosity came with consequences. Her thoughts turned inward as she moved cautiously forward. She remembered the figure again, how it had acknowledged her, recognized her presence in a way that went beyond sight or sound. She realized that fear itself was part of the entity's method of control, shaping behavior, conditioning her reactions, bending her will without a touch. She shivered as the truth became clear. She was not just observed, she was studied, measured, and tested. Every instinct she had was being manipulated by the environment, by the unseen, by the entity that lingered just beyond her perception. The path eventually led her to a clearing, faint moonlight piercing the fog, illuminating the forest in silver-gray tones. For a moment she felt a sense of relief, as though she had escaped, as though the world outside the chapel had regained some semblance of normalcy. Yet even here in the open, she felt the weight of eyes upon her. The forest seemed to breathe, each rustle and whisper amplified by the fog, carrying messages she could not understand. She realized that the chapel's influence extended far beyond its walls, that the shadow it cast was not confined to stone and wood, but stretched like a dark web into the surrounding world, touching all who dared enter. She paused, catching her breath, reflecting on the lessons of the day. Fear was not merely a reaction, it was a tool, a weapon wielded with precision. The chapel had demonstrated this clearly, and she had been its unwilling pupil. She understood now that survival was not about strength or speed, but about awareness, adaptability, and respect for the forces she could not see. Every choice, every movement, every thought carried weight. The forest and the chapel had taught her this lesson, harshly and unmistakably. The night pressed on, fog thickening, stars obscured by clouds, and she knew she could not linger. Her journey back to the familiar paths, the safety of her home, was only partially reassuring. She carried with her the memory of the chapel, the weight of the shadows, and the presence that had touched her very essence. She knew that the experience would haunt her, shaping her perceptions, her fears, and her courage. Even as the first rays of dawn began to pierce the gray horizon, she felt the lingering influence, a reminder that the dark had not released her, that some forces are patient, eternal, and unyielding. By the time she reached the edge of the forest, her mind was a whirl of sensations and realizations. The chapel had not merely been a building, it had been a trial, a sentinel of ancient secrets, a keeper of fear. And she had survived. She had been marked, changed, and yet she had endured. The experience had left an indelible impression, one that would follow her for the rest of her life, a dark story she could neither forget nor fully comprehend. She paused once more, looking back toward the chapel, its dark silhouette partially obscured by the fog. A shiver ran down her spine, but this time it was mingled with determination. She had witnessed the impossible, survived the terrifying, and understood the delicate balance between fear and courage. She knew that the story of the chapel was far from over. The shadows waited, patient, but she carried within her a spark, fragile yet enduring, the spark of someone who had faced darkness and survived. He was chained in the cold, damp room, the weight of the iron pressing into his wrists and ankles a constant reminder of his captivity. The air was thick and heavy with the scent of mold and rust, each breath he took tasting faintly of iron and decay. Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows, rattling the wooden shutters and sending gusts that carried with them a chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. He had been warned that this place was merciless, that those who faltered, even slightly, would be broken before the day ended. Yet nothing had prepared him for the oppressive silence, for the way it wrapped itself around him, constricting like a living thing. Every heartbeat echoed loudly in his ears, a metronome marking the passage of time in a room that seemed suspended, timeless, yet unbearably long. He tried to move, shifting against the iron chains, testing their hold, feeling the bite of rusted metal on his skin. Every attempt to adjust brought pain, sharp and unyielding. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to endure, to remain still despite the discomfort, because he knew that any noise, any hint of weakness, could invite the attention of the overseer or the master. The room seemed to breathe with him, shadows crawling along the walls, cast by the flickering candlelight from a single sconce mounted high above. The shadows danced, stretching and shrinking in ways that made the walls themselves feel alive, watching, waiting. His mind wandered to the stories he had heard before arriving here, the tales of others who had been chained in this very room, who had vanished without a trace, whose screams had filled the hallways in the dead of night. He had dismissed them once as exaggerations, cautionary tales meant to frighten newcomers. Now, trapped in the oppressive gloom, he realized that the stories had been warnings, fragments of truth designed to prepare the unwary for what lay ahead. Fear was not abstract here. It was tactile, tangible, and it had a presence, pressing down upon him with each passing moment. The first footsteps came without warning, echoing through the corridor outside his cell. Each step was deliberate, heavy, announcing presence, authority, and intent. He froze, heart hammering, listening as the sound approached. The door creaked open, and a figure entered, silhouetted against the dim light spilling from the hallway. The figure said nothing at first, merely observing, and the weight of that gaze was enough to make him shrink against the chains, to feel smaller, less human. It was a calculated intimidation, designed to erode his sense of self, to instill compliance without the need for immediate violence. The figure finally spoke, words clipped and measured. They were not shouted, but each syllable carried a force that pressed against his mind, forcing him to acknowledge his position. "You have been warned," the voice said, cold and precise. "Obedience is not optional." He nodded, understanding that defiance, even silent defiance, was noted, remembered, and would be addressed. Fear was being taught here, drilled into him through patience, observation, and careful calibration of power. He realized that the lessons of the chapel were not only in its walls, but in the people who inhabited them, each enforcing the invisible rules with relentless precision. Time passed slowly, measured by the faint flicker of candlelight and the distant sounds of life outside the room. Occasionally, the figure returned, bringing small tasks or reminders, each act seemingly mundane yet loaded with significance. A misstep, a hesitation, a sign of discomfort, all were observed and catalogued, and he understood that each interaction was a test, a measure of his resilience, his compliance, and his understanding of the hierarchy he was now a part of. The chains were not just physical. They were a manifestation of the control exerted over him, a reminder that freedom was conditional and trust was non-existent. He began to study the patterns of the overseer's movements, the subtle cues in tone and gesture, trying to anticipate the next approach. His body, though bound, became a vessel of alertness, each muscle coiled in readiness. He realized that survival depended not on brute strength alone, but on perception, awareness, and the ability to respond without error. The room itself, once perceived as a prison, became a field for observation, a place where he could learn the rhythms of authority and the boundaries of his own endurance. Night deepened, shadows thickening in corners, curling along the walls and floors. The candlelight flickered, casting erratic shapes that say, "Emed almost alive," moving independently of their sources. He could not tell what was real and what was imagined, yet he understood that imagination and fear were intertwined here, each feeding the other, shaping perception and heightening tension. Every creak of the floorboards outside, every whisper of wind through the broken windows, became a potential signal, a possible warning of what was to come. Hunger and thirst became secondary to the terror that occupied his mind. The chains, once merely restrictive, now felt like extensions of the fear itself, linking his body to the room's oppressive atmosphere. He tested his resolve, enduring the discomfort, the weight, and the isolation. He knew that breaking, even mentally, would make him vulnerable, and that vulnerability could be exploited in ways far more damaging than physical punishment. The lessons of obedience were clear. The mind must submit as much as the body, or both would be fractured. As dawn approached, faint light crept through the broken windows, illuminating the room in muted grays and golds. He felt the presence again, subtle but undeniable, a weight pressing upon him, a silent observation that did not waver. He understood that this was part of the ritual of fear, to remind him constantly that he was never alone, that the system was ever present, patient, and vigilant. The awareness gnawed at him, a reminder that survival required not only endurance, but careful calculation, the ability to anticipate, adapt, and comply without losing oneself entirely. By mid-morning, the first minor tasks of the day arrived, each accompanied by scrutiny and judgment. He performed each with precision, aware that even the smallest misstep could provoke the overseer's ire. The chains, the room, the figure, They were all components of a greater mechanism designed to mold him, to teach obedience, to extract compliance. He realized that this was a game played not with brute force alone, but with patience, strategy, and the subtle application of terror. Over the following days, he began to notice small patterns, cues in voice, gesture, and timing that allowed him to anticipate the overseer's next move. He learned to respond almost instinctively, to navigate the expectations imposed upon him without overt resistance, yet without surrendering entirely to despair. The chains remained, the room remained, and the figure remained, but within that rigid framework, he found slivers of control, moments of decision, and opportunities to assert a quiet presence. He understood that fear was being taught as a language here, one that could be read, interpreted, and even negotiated to a degree. Every glance, every pause, every measured action was part of the curriculum, designed to instill understanding without the need for overt violence. Yet the threat of escalation was constant, ever present, and he learned to carry it with him as a companion, a reminder of the stakes at hand. Weeks passed, each day a repetition of observation, endurance, and subtle adaptation. The chains, once constraining, became familiar, almost extensions of his body, each movement measured, deliberate, and informed by the constant presence of authority. He became attuned to the rhythms of the chapel and its surrounding grounds, understanding that survival depended on more than physical strength. It required mental acuity, patience, and the ability to navigate fear with calculated precision. Through it all, he began to notice the faintest signs of the supernatural, the hints of something beyond the purely human presence in the room. Shadows that moved independently, whispers that carried meaning without words, and a sense of being observed not only by the living but by forces older and more patient than time itself. He realized that the lessons of obedience, fear, and survival were intertwined with these forces, shaping perception, testing resolve, and ultimately determining who could endure and who would succumb. By the end of the month, he had adapted. He was still chained, still observed, but he moved with purpose, awareness, and resilience. He understood the patterns of control, the subtle mechanisms of authority, and the underlying currents of the chapel's presence. Fear remained, but it had transformed into a tool, a guide, a constant companion that sharpened his instincts and honed his understanding of the world around him. He had survived, but survival came with a price. The room had imprinted itself upon him, the chains had become part of his consciousness, and the figure, whether human, shadow, or something beyond comprehension, had left its mark indelibly on his mind. He understood that freedom, if it came at all, would not be simple, and that every action, every decision, every flicker of thought would be scrutinized, measured, and judged by forces both visible and unseen. In the end, he realized that the chapel and its overseers, the chains and the shadows, were more than punishment. They were a crucible. Those who survived emerged, changed, sharpened, and aware of the delicate balance between fear and control, obedience and defiance, survival and surrender. He had learned that lesson, painfully, utterly, and without the possibility of forgetting. And as he sat in the dim light, hands resting against the iron, he felt a strange sense of understanding, almost respect, for the system that had broken him, taught him, and left him alive. It was a cruel, relentless teacher, but its lessons were unmistakable, and he knew they would stay with him, shaping his every thought and movement, long after the chains were gone. A father's choice had never seemed so absolute, so final. The night had descended with a silence so thick it seemed to press against the walls of the plantation house, against the wooden floors, against the very air itself. She had watched him carefully, noting every twitch of his fingers, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the coldness in his eyes. This was not the warmth of a protective parent, This was something else entirely, an authority sharpened to a blade, a determination unyielding, a resolve that brooked no opposition. She had tried to reason, to appeal to his humanity, but the weight of his decision pressed down on her before words could form. There was no room for negotiation, no space for doubt. The candlelight flickered across his face as he sat in the corner of the dimly lit room, the shadows emphasizing the stark planes of his expression. She noticed the lines etched deep from years of hard choices, but tonight, those lines seemed carved with finality. He had made a decision, one that would shape the course of her life, of theirs all. She felt the gravity of the moment in her chest, each heartbeat resonating with fear and anticipation. There was no turning back, not now. The air seemed to thrum with the quiet intensity of the unspoken, the unseen, and the inevitable. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees and carrying with it a faint scent of smoke, of burning leaves, of something more intangible and primal. It seemed as though the very elements conspired to heighten the tension, to underscore the severity of the choice made. She had grown up with stories of obedience and fear, of power and consequence, but none had prepared her for this moment, when decision and destiny intertwined so completely. She could feel the weight of history, of lineage, pressing upon her shoulders, reminding her that she was not merely a participant, but a witness to forces greater than herself. The father rose slowly, deliberately, each movement controlled, precise, as though every step were a statement. His gaze met hers, and in that look, she saw the absolute conviction of one who had weighed options, measured risks, and arrived at a conclusion that brooked no interference. She felt the pull of inevitability, the slow, inexorable draw of events set into motion long before she had even stepped into this room. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend the scope of the decision, trying to find a loophole, a crack in the armor of his certainty. But there was none. The choice had been made, and now it was a blade suspended above her, waiting. She attempted to speak, to plead, but the words caught in her throat, strangled by the gravity of the situation. Silence reigned, punctuated only by the faint creak of the floorboards under his weight and the occasional crackle of the candle flame. She felt the air constrict around her, thick with expectation, laden with the unspoken consequences of defiance. The father's eyes never wavered, never softened. There was no mercy here, only the execution of judgment as absolute as it was deliberate. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity. She tried to anchor herself in sensation, in touch, in sound, but the oppressive atmosphere seemed to distort perception. Shadows deepened in the corners, and the flickering candlelight cast shapes across the walls that seemed almost alive, whispering of past decisions, of those who had faced similar moments, of those who had faltered and been lost. She realized then that the room itself was a witness, a participant, an extension of the father's will, echoing and amplifying the intensity of the choice he had made. He spoke at last, his voice calm, measured, deliberate, each word struck with the precision of inevitability, leaving no room for misinterpretation or resistance. She absorbed them, letting them sink into her consciousness, each syllable etching itself into memory. The decision was irrevocable, the path chosen, and the consequences set into motion. She understood that this moment would not merely affect her, but the lives of all those connected to this place, all those who had come before, and all who would come after. The father gestured, a subtle movement that carried the weight of authority and finality. She obeyed, not out of submission but out of recognition that resistance would only accelerate the consequences already in motion. Each action she took was deliberate, measured, a reflection of her understanding of the stakes, her awareness of the mechanisms of control and power in this space. She moved through the room like one navigating a labyrinth of consequences, each step guided by instinct, observation, and a deep, abiding fear that anchored her to reality. Outside, the wind carried faint whispers, echoes of past decisions, of choices made and paths diverged. She felt the pull of those echoes, a reminder that history was never silent, that the weight of the past pressed into the present, shaping perception, guiding action, and underscoring the gravity of the moment. She realized that the father's choice was not merely personal but emblematic of broader forces at play, forces of control, authority, and legacy that extended beyond the walls of the room, beyond the lives contained within it. The night wore on, each hour a study in endurance, observation, and compliance. She learned to read the subtle cues in his movements, in his tone, in the way the shadows shifted with the candlelight. Every detail mattered. Every hesitation, every misstep, every perceptual slip could trigger consequences, immediate or deferred, subtle or overt. She understood that survival required not merely attention, but an almost preternatural attunement to environment, timing, and the nuanced expressions of authority. Her mind wandered to those who had come before, who had faced similar judgments, and she felt a kinship with them, a connection forged through fear, endurance, and the silent understanding that some forces were beyond human negotiation. The father's choice was a crucible, testing not only obedience but perception, resilience, and the capacity to endure psychological and emotional strain. She recognized that the lessons embedded in this night would outlive it, becoming part of her, shaping her thoughts, her instincts, and her responses in ways subtle yet profound. She navigated the night with deliberate care, pushing the limits of awareness, testing the boundaries of fear, and calibrating responses to ensure survival. The candlelight flickered, shadows twisted, and the air thickened with expectation, yet she maintained focus, drawing strength from knowledge, observation, and the clarity born of necessity. She had come to understand that power resided not only in physical force, but in psychological control, in the manipulation of fear and anticipation, in the orchestration of circumstances that compelled action without overt threat. Hours passed, or perhaps it was minutes. The passage of time seemed irrelevant, distorted by the intensity of the experience. She learned to move fluidly, almost invisibly, within the constraints imposed upon her, her body and mind functioning in unison to navigate an environment designed to test and dominate. The father's presence was constant, a reminder of authority, vigilance, and expectation, shaping every decision, every movement, every breath. By the early hours of dawn, a fragile equilibrium had been achieved. She was exhausted, both physically and mentally, yet acutely aware, attuned to the rhythms of the room, the subtle signals of oversight, and the invisible currents of power and fear. She understood that this night, this trial, had imprinted lessons far beyond the immediate consequences, teaching endurance, awareness, and the delicate balance between compliance and self-preservation. The first light of day crept into the room, illuminating the father's face and casting long shadows across the floor. She met his gaze, recognizing in it the culmination of the night's decisions, the certainty of choice, and the unyielding presence of authority. She realized that this encounter, this night, would remain with her forever, a dark story etched into memory, shaping perception, instinct, and the understanding of control and consequence. As she finally moved toward the door, leaving the oppressive weight of the room behind, she carried with her not only the memory of fear, but the hard-won knowledge of endurance. She understood the nature of power, the inevitability of certain decisions, and the necessity of navigating forces beyond immediate comprehension. The father's choice had defined the night, shaped her experience, and left an indelible mark, a story of darkness, authority, and the human capacity to endure even in the face of overwhelming certainty. She emerged into the soft light of morning, the air fresh yet heavy with the memory of the night, and felt a strange clarity settle over her. The lessons of obedience, fear, and perception were etched deeply into her consciousness, guiding her movements, informing her thoughts, and fortifying her resolve. The father's choice had been absolute, unyielding, and yet, within the boundaries of its execution, she had discovered resilience, awareness, and a profound understanding of survival. The night was over, but its story would remain, a narrative of darkness, authority, and endurance that would follow her wherever she went, shaping her understanding of the world, the forces that governed it, and the intricate dance between fear and power that defined survival. The rain had started softly, barely a whisper against the broken roof of the chapel. Soon it grew heavier, drumming a relentless rhythm across the stone walls. She could feel the vibrations through the floor, each drop a tiny hammer striking the memory of the chapel into her mind. The air smelled of wet earth and cold stone, a scent that seemed to seep into her very pores, mingling with the lingering fear that had taken root during her last visit. She had thought she was prepared, had imagined that understanding the chapel's influence would grant her some measure of control, but as the storm intensified, she realized how little she truly understood. The room before her was as it had been, yet changed. Shadows clung more thickly to the corners, moving independently of the flickering candlelight, curling and stretching as if alive. She could see the outlines of broken pews, the remnants of old candles melted into grotesque shapes, and the altar, blackened at the edges, seemed almost to pulse with an unseen heartbeat. She pushed forward, the wheelchair wheels scraping against the uneven stone floor, the sound echoing like a cry in the cavernous space. The chapel had a presence that was almost tangible, pressing against her, shaping her movements, testing her resolve. Her eyes caught on the symbols etched into the altar's base, spirals and jagged lines carved with precision, each one radiating a subtle but undeniable power. She could feel their intent, a magnetic pull that urged her closer, even as fear screamed for retreat. Each symbol seemed to thrum with energy, communicating in a language beyond words, a dark and ancient dialect that spoke of control, observation, and consequences. She tried to resist, but the pull was strong, compelling her attention, helping her focus. A sudden sound made her start, a whisper of movement behind one of the shattered windows. She spun her chair toward the source, but saw nothing, only the shifting shadows cast by the storm outside. The air seemed to vibrate with anticipation, the chapel itself alive with expectation. She remembered the stories of those who had entered before, those who had been lost within the walls of this place. The fear they had felt, she realized, was not simply terror, it was education, a lesson in the delicate and unforgiving language of the supernatural. She approached the altar, hands trembling, as the shadows thickened and the candlelight danced erratically. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, each one accompanied by a sense of being observed, judged, and measured. She had thought herself courageous, prepared to face the darkness, but the chapel had a way of humbling even the strongest resolve. It whispered in every creak, in every flicker of light, in every subtle shift of air, reminding her that she was not in control, that the forces within these walls had patience measured in lifetimes, and that her presence here was both intrusion and opportunity. Her mind raced as she studied the altar's symbols, attempting to discern a pattern, a key, a method of navigation. Each spiral and jagged line seemed to react to her gaze, shifting subtly, rearranging in ways imperceptible yet undeniable. She realized then that the chapel was testing her, not merely challenging her physical presence, but her perception, her understanding, and her capacity to interpret the unspoken rules that governed this space. The shadows at the edges of her vision shifted in response, and she sensed a subtle approval, or perhaps amusement, at her engagement with the ancient codes. Suddenly, A cold gust of wind blew through the broken windows, extinguishing the candles and plunging the room into darkness. Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm, drawing on every lesson she had learned in previous encounters. The air was thick with expectation, and, in the darkness, she could feel the presence more acutely, as though the chapel itself were leaning closer, curious, testing, demanding her attention. She reached out, fingertips brushing the stone floor, seeking orientation, finding both connection and warning in the texture beneath her. The whispers began again, soft and indistinct at first, then gradually clearer, threading through her consciousness, with a rhythm she could not ignore. They spoke of movement, of timing, of the consequences of misstep and hesitation. She followed the guidance instinctively, moving her chair along the familiar cracks and markings in the stone, interpreting the chapel's subtle cues with a precision born of fear and experience. Each motion was deliberate, a negotiation with the shadows, the stones, and the unseen presences that governed this domain. Minutes stretched into an eternity as she navigated the room, responding to the unspoken signals and the faint tactile feedback from the stone floor. She became acutely aware of every detail: the temperature of the air, the vibration of the floorboards, the scent of dampness mixing with the faint remnants of smoke and wax. The chapel was a living entity, and she had become part of its intricate dance, a participant in a trial of perception, patience, and courage. At the center of the room, she paused near the altar once more. The symbols here seemed to glow faintly, pulsing with energy that was both ancient and deliberate. She understood then that the chapel was not merely a space of fear. It was a teacher, a judge, and a test of endurance. Each interaction with its elements carried meaning, each movement of shadows a lesson in navigation, perception, and subtle command. Her breath slowed as she absorbed this truth, recognizing that survival here depended on mental acuity as much as physical awareness. The whispers intensified, layering over one another, creating a symphony of sound that seemed almost musical in its complexity. She could discern patterns now, subtle cues woven into the fabric of the chapel's voice, each guiding her actions, each demanding attention. She moved carefully, deliberately, interpreting these signals with a combination of instinct, observation, and cautious calculation. Every inch of progress was earned, every adjustment a negotiation with the unseen forces that governed this ancient place. Hours passed in this manner, her mind and body locked in a constant feedback loop of observation, movement, and reaction. The storm outside raged on, rain lashing the broken windows, wind moaning through the rafters, but she remained focused, attuned to the delicate signals of the chapel itself. Fear remained a companion, but it had become a tool, sharpening her awareness, guiding her decisions, and reinforcing the lessons she had learned. As dawn approached, the storm began to abate, and the first faint light of morning filtered through the cracks in the roof. The chapel, still alive with the residue of night, seemed to acknowledge her progress, the shadows relaxing slightly, the symbols pulsing with a slower rhythm. She understood that she had passed a test, navigated a trial, and engaged with forces beyond simple comprehension. The weight of the night's experience pressed upon her, leaving an indelible mark on her mind and body, yet also a sense of accomplishment, clarity, and survival. She rolled toward the exit, every movement deliberate, attuned to the subtle feedback of the floor and the shifting shadows. The chapel had revealed its lessons, not in words but in experience, and she carried them with her, a profound understanding of fear, endurance, and the interplay of observation, timing, and consequence. She emerged into the morning light, rain-slicked ground under her wheels, the air crisp and heavy with the scent of wet earth and renewal. Though she had left the physical space of the chapel, its presence lingered in her consciousness. The whispers, the shadows, the pulsing symbols, These had become part of her awareness, shaping her instincts, her perceptions, and her understanding of the world beyond. She realized that the dark lessons of the night would accompany her, a constant reminder of the delicate balance between courage, fear, and survival in spaces governed by forces beyond human comprehension. She paused briefly at the threshold, looking back at the chapel's dark silhouette. Rainwater streamed down its stone walls, and the shadows seemed to shimmer in the morning light. She felt a deep, resonant understanding that the chapel was patient, eternal, and relentless. It had tested her, marked her, and yet also imparted wisdom. She had survived, not unscathed, but transformed. Ahmed, attuned to the whispers of the unseen, aware of the shadows that lurk just beyond perception, and prepared for the subtle, relentless trials that life and the darkness would present. The cold air settled over the abandoned estate like a shroud, pressing against the walls, slipping through cracks in the doors, seeping into every crevice with an unrelenting presence. She had entered this place knowing only fragments of its history, rumors of cruelty, whispers of disappearance, stories of those who had vanished without trace. Yet nothing could have prepared her for the oppressive weight that seemed to hang over the estate, a living, breathing entity that observed every step, measured every breath, and catalogued every thought. Even before she touched the threshold, she felt its awareness, a consciousness older than the stones beneath her wheels, a vigilance that did not forgive or forget. The hallway stretched before her like a tunnel of shadows, the ceiling sagging under the weight of decay, wallpaper peeled in curling strips, revealing layers of history and neglect. Dust motes floated in the weak light filtering through broken windows, each particle suspended like a testament to stillness and silence. Her wheels creaked against the wooden floor, a sound amplified by the emptiness, reverberating through the corridors as though announcing her presence to unseen inhabitants. She paused briefly, listening for echoes of life, for the faintest sign of movement, but the estate remained still, save for the groan of the building settling and the wind whispering through the shattered panes. She moved cautiously, aware that every shadow could conceal a threat, every room a trap. Her mind raced, recalling previous encounters with the chapel, the forest, the plantation, all places where the line between reality and something darker had blurred. Here, the rules were different, subtler, the threats less visible, but no less potent. She understood instinctively that the estate itself was a test, a crucible designed to measure endurance, observation, and resolve. Each creak of the floorboards, each flicker of light, each cold draft carried intent, guiding or warning, testing or punishing. Her attention was drawn to a staircase leading to the upper floors. The steps were warped and uneven, but she knew she had to ascend. The upper rooms held answers, or perhaps more questions. Each step upward a negotiation with the building itself, each wheel turn measured against the treacherous wood. Shadows stretched across the walls, creating shapes that were almost human, moving independently as if the estate remembered those who had once walked these halls and projected their essence into the present. Fear rose in her chest, yet alongside it, a surge of determination. Survival demanded movement, and movement required courage. At the top of the stairs, a long corridor stretched into darkness, punctuated by doors that hung crooked on their hinges. She approached the first, testing the air, noting the subtle shift in temperature, the faint odor of decay, the almost imperceptible whisper of presence. She entered slowly, aware that the room could conceal observation or intent, that walls might have eyes and floors might carry echoes of past tragedies. The light from the broken windows cast angular beams, illuminating fragments of furniture, tattered curtains, and the remnants of lives long departed. Each detail was a puzzle, each shadow a clue, and she absorbed it all, understanding that comprehension was as vital as caution. She came across the remnants of a study, books strewn across the floor, papers yellowed with age, ink smeared by time and neglect. Symbols were scrawled across the margins of pages, spirals and jagged lines reminiscent of those she had seen at the chapel. Her pulse quickened as she realized that these markings were a pattern, a language of fear and control extending beyond one location.